The forest is silent. Not quiet the way a room goes quiet when someone leaves, but silent the way the world was before we filled it with noise. You can feel the cold moving through the trees like something alive, threading between the pines, pressing against your skin. The light is low. The ground is frozen, and somewhere beneath the mist, the earth is watching. You are standing alone. No phone, no lighter, no knife, no map, just you, and everything that has ever tested a human being since the beginning of time. Now ask yourself honestly, could you survive? For most people living today, that question doesn't just spark panic. It reveals something uncomfortable. A gap. A silence inside us where knowledge used to live. Studies suggest that over 90% of adults in the modern world cannot start a fire without a manufactured tool. Most cannot identify a single edible plant within a mile of where they stand. And almost none could find clean water before thirst became dangerous. We have traded survival for convenience, and most of us made that trade without even realizing it. But here is where the story changes. Because 500 years ago, across the vast and unforgiving landscapes of North America, there were people for whom that same forest, that same frozen silence, that same raw and indifferent wilderness, was not a threat. It was home. Native American tribes did not panic in the wild. They listened to it. They read it. They lived inside it the way you live inside your own house, with ease, with purpose, and with a knowledge so deep it had become instinct. And they carried something with them, something small enough to hang at the waist and light enough to run with. Something that no museum has ever fully explained, and that no survival manual has completely captured. A kit, a hidden system of tools so precisely chosen, so perfectly balanced, that it could sustain a human life through storm, starvation, and the cruelest winters the continent could produce. Before this video ends, you will understand why modern survival experts call this kit a paradox. Because the less it contained, the more powerful it became. And the people who carried it, they were not just survivors. They were something else entirely. Stay with me, because what is inside that pouch will change the way you see the world you think you already know. Picture it in your hands. A pouch no larger than your fist, stitched from deer hide or woven bark, worn smooth at the edges from years of daily touch. It smells of smoke and pine, and something older, something you cannot name but somehow recognize. It is light. Surprisingly, almost impossibly light. And yet inside this small, unremarkable bundle lay everything a human being needed to live, move, heal, and endure in one of the most demanding environments on Earth. This was not a bag packed in haste. Every single item inside had been chosen across generations of trial, failure, observation, and hard-won understanding. Nothing entered that pouch by accident, and nothing stayed inside it that did not earn its place. The first thing you would find was the fire kit. Flint chips, a small hand-carved bow drill, a spindle of dry cedar or willow, and a nest of shredded bark or cattail fluff pressed into a tight bundle. Together, these were not just tools. They were the difference between life and death on a night when the temperature dropped without warning. Next came the cutting tools. Sharp flakes of obsidian or chert, so precisely fractured that their edges were, by scientific measurement, sharper than modern surgical steel. Alongside them, bone needles thin enough to pass through wet hide, and a small scraper shaped from a deer's rib, polished smooth by 1,000 uses. Then the cordage. Twisted fibers of yucca, milkweed, or cedar bark, coiled tightly, and capable of bearing weight that would surprise any engineer alive today. This was their rope, their thread, their trap line, and their safety net, all in one continuous strand, no thicker than a finger. Beneath the cordage lay the medicine, small parcels of dried herbs wrapped carefully in birch bark, each one a cure that had been tested not in a laboratory, but in the living world over hundreds of years. Crushed willow bark for pain, dried yarrow for wounds that would not stop bleeding, pine resin hardened into a dark amber seal, and sage, always sage, for the sicknesses that lived not only in the body, but in the spirit. After the medicine came the food tools. Lightweight stone arrowheads no bigger than a thumbnail, a coil of sinew strong enough to serve as a bowstring or a snare line, and a small hide pouch of dried seeds and berries, that could sustain a person through 2 days of hard travel when nothing else was available. Then came the sixth layer, the one that modern survivalists often overlook entirely: the talisman. A carved stone, a painted shell, a single hawk feather bound with a thread of red fiber. To the untrained eye, it looks decorative, but to the person who carried it, it was perhaps the most essential item in the entire kit. Because survival, they understood, was never purely physical. Fear kills faster than cold. Despair arrives before starvation. The talisman was the anchor, the reminder that the person carrying it was not alone in the wild, but connected to something larger than hunger, larger than danger, larger than the dark. And then there was the seventh item, the one that no museum catalog has ever quite known how to label. A piece of birch bark, thin and carefully folded, marked with faint lines and small pressed symbols. Not decoration, not art, a map, a calendar, a letter written to no one and everyone. A record of which plants bloomed in which season, which rivers ran clean in which month, and which paths through the mountains the elk used when the snow came early. In 1994, archaeologists excavating a site in the Pacific Northwest uncovered a preserved pouch that had been sealed in dry soil for over 800 years. Every item inside it was still intact, and every item was still functional. That detail should stop you for a moment. 800 years, and still ready to use. That is not primitive technology. That is perfection. Now we go deeper, because knowing what was inside the pouch is only the beginning. The real question is not what these tools were. It is what these people understood about the world that made those tools work. And to answer that, we need to look at the 4 pillars that held everything together: fire, water, food, medicine, not as items on a checklist, but as living relationships. 4 agreements between a human being and the earth beneath their feet. Fire came first. It always does. And the way they made it tells you something profound about how they thought. The bow drill was not a backup plan. It was a practice, a daily ritual of friction and patience and breath. The spindle pressed into the hearthboard, the bow drawn back and forward in a steady rhythm, the hands learning the exact pressure, the exact speed that coaxed heat from wood. Scientists have measured the process. At peak friction, the temperature at the point of contact reaches over 800 degrees Fahrenheit. In under 60 seconds, no battery required, no fuel purchased, just wood, fiber, and a human being who understood exactly what they were doing. But here is what the survival manuals never tell you. The fire was never allowed to die through the night, not because keeping it alive was always practical, but because they believed the flame held a living connection to those who had sat around fires before them. To let it go dark was to break a thread that ran all the way back through time. The ember was not just heat, it was memory. It was presence. It was proof that the people who came before had not been forgotten. Water came next, and their relationship with it was something closer to fluency than technique. They did not simply search for water. They read the land the way you read a familiar face, looking for signs so subtle that most modern eyes would pass over them entirely without registering a single detail. The direction a certain bird flew at dusk. The particular shade of green where the grass grew thicker along a ridge. The way the air changed texture, just slightly, when a stream was close enough to sense but still too far to hear. These were not guesses. They were a language, built from thousands of hours of attention paid to a world that was always speaking. And some tribes, it has been recorded, taught their children to find water before they were taught almost anything else. Before reading the stars, before naming the plants. Water first. Because without it, nothing else was possible. Once found, it was purified using the Earth's own chemistry. Charcoal from the previous night's fire was layered inside a cone of birch bark alongside sand and river pebbles and moss, each material pulling a different kind of impurity from the water as it passed through. In colder months, stones heated in the fire were dropped into birch bark containers to bring the water to a full boil, without metal, without machinery, without anything that could not be found within 100 steps of where they stood. Food was never hunted or gathered in the way that word implies today, with urgency, with desperation, with the frantic energy of someone who does not know where the next meal is coming from. They moved through the landscape with the calm confidence of someone reading a menu they had memorized long ago. The digging stick, hardened in fire until its tip was nearly as tough as stone, could unearth prairie turnips or cattail roots from frozen ground without breaking. Snare lines of sinew set along animal trails before dawn could mean a rabbit or a grouse by mid-morning, enough protein to sustain hard travel for another full day. Stone arrowheads napped thin enough to whistle through the air, were carried in small leather pouches, and could be fitted to a shaft in minutes. But the real knowledge, the knowledge that separated a person who could survive from a person who could truly live, was the plant knowledge. Which leaves could be boiled into a broth that restored energy when the body was exhausted. Which bark, when chewed slowly, quieted hunger long enough to reach the next water source. Which berries the birds ate freely, and which ones the birds avoided completely. That silence around a berry bush was itself a warning, a signal written in the behavior of every living thing that shared the landscape. They didn't hunt to conquer. They moved through the food chain the way a river moves through rock, not forcing, flowing, completing a circle that had been turning long before they arrived and would keep turning long after they passed through. And then came medicine. This is where the story becomes something that modern science is only now beginning to fully appreciate. The willow bark they carried, and ground into powder for pain and fever, contained salicylic acid, the same compound that pharmaceutical companies synthesized in the late 1800s and sold to the world as aspirin. They had been using it for centuries before that patent was ever filed. The yarrow they pressed into open wounds to stop bleeding contains achillitin, a compound that actively accelerates blood clotting. The pine resin they use to seal cuts is a natural antiseptic with documented antibacterial properties. These were not folk remedies built on superstition. They were empirical discoveries made through generations of careful, patient observation of cause and effect in living bodies over real time. But what separated their medicine from ours was not the chemistry, it was the philosophy behind it. They did not treat a wound and ignore the person carrying it. They did not separate the body from the conditions that had broken it down. Every remedy came wrapped in a question. Why is this person out of balance? What in their relationship with the world around them has shifted? Because they understood something that modern medicine is slowly rediscovering. You cannot heal a person fully while treating them as though they exist in isolation from everything that surrounds them. Every remedy was also a reminder. You are not separate from the earth. You are an expression of it. And when you are sick, it is often because somewhere, in some way, that expression has been interrupted. The medicine in that small pouch was not just chemistry. It was a conversation between the human body and the living world that had produced every ingredient inside it. And that conversation, they believed, was the oldest form of healing there was. We need to pause here, because everything we have covered so far, the fire, the water, the food, the medicine, all of it points towards something that cannot be held in the hand or placed inside a leather pouch. Something that was, in the end, the most powerful survival tool they carried. Not a technique, not a material, a way of seeing. And once you understand it, you will never look at a wilderness or at your own life quite the same way again. Here is a number that should make you stop. The average modern survival kit weighs between 8 and 12 kilograms, packed with redundancies, backup tools, emergency rations, waterproof layers, and enough gear to manage nearly every scenario a manufacturer could imagine. And yet the people who built those kits, the experts who designed them, openly admit that the most common cause of death in a wilderness survival situation is not cold, not thirst, not starvation. It is panic. It is the collapse of the mind before the body has even begun to fail. Now consider what the Native American traveler carried. 400 grams, sometimes less. A pouch that fit in one hand, and they were not less prepared. They were more free, because they had understood something that we have spent centuries trying to package and sell back to ourselves. That real security does not live in what you carry. It lives in what you know. And more than that, in what you trust. Modern psychology has a name for the kind of intelligence they had built their entire survival system around. It is called embodied cognition. The understanding that the body processes information about the world before the conscious mind catches up. That instinct is not irrational. It is simply faster. They did not ignore that speed. They trained it. Every child learned to feel the change in air pressure before a storm arrived, to sense the stillness that preceded a predator, to notice the particular quality of silence that meant the forest was holding its breath. These were not supernatural gifts. They were skills, developed through years of paying attention to a world that rewarded attention with life and punished distraction with death. And that training, that deep and embodied awareness, was the invisible seventh item in the kit, the one that made everything else work. But there is something even beneath that, something that the language of psychology does not quite reach, because at the center of everything they carried, every spark they struck, and every root they harvested, and every wound they dressed with yarrow and pine resin, there was a single unspoken belief that held it all together. The belief that they were not passing through the wilderness. They were part of it, not visitors, not conquerors, not even survivors in the way we use that word today, implying that the wild is something to be endured and escaped. They were participants, members of a community that included the trees and the rivers and the animals and the weather and the soil beneath their feet. And that membership came with responsibilities. You did not take more than you needed. You did not waste what you were given. You did not move through the landscape without leaving it better, or at least no worse, than you found it. This was not environmentalism as a philosophy. It was survival as a relationship. And the kit was its physical expression. Every item inside it was borrowed from the earth with the full intention of returning it. The flint would eventually shatter and become soil again. The cordage would rot back into fiber. The birch bark would dissolve into the forest floor. Nothing was owned. Everything was held in trust. Now close your eyes for a moment and think about the most overwhelmed you have felt in the last year. The moment when everything felt like too much, when the noise and the speed and the demands of modern life pressed in from every direction at once. That feeling has a name in the language of contemporary mental health research. It is called cognitive overload, and it is, by nearly every measure available, at epidemic levels across the developed world. Now think about what the person carrying that 400-gram pouch felt when they stepped into the same forest that terrifies us. Not overload, clarity, not panic, presence. The most terrifying thing about their survival kit is not what is inside it. It is what it says about everything we have lost. Everything we traded away so quietly, so gradually, that most of us did not even notice it was gone, until we found ourselves standing at the edge of something wild, and realized, with a sudden and hollow certainty, that we had no idea what to do next. That gap between them and us is not a gap in technology. It is a gap in relationship, and the kit, that small, worn, smoke-scented pouch, is the map back across it. If we are willing to learn how to read it again, remember the paradox we opened with, the one that modern survival experts keep returning to when they study these kits. The less it contained, the more powerful it became. Now you understand why. Because the kit was never really about the tools. It was about the person holding them. Every item inside that pouch was a mirror, a reflection of how deeply someone had paid attention to the world around them. And the smaller the kit, the larger the person had to be to carry it. That is the paradox. Not a contradiction, a compression. Centuries of understanding pressed into 400 grams of leather and bone and fiber and ash. And what lives inside that compression is not lost. It has simply been waiting. You can see it breathing in the modern bushcraft movement, where thousands of people across the world are quietly setting down their smartphones and picking up fire steels and learning for the first time how to coax an ember from wood with nothing but friction and patience and breath. You can see it in the rewilding movement, where ecologists and communities are beginning to restore not just landscapes, but relationships between people and the soil, between neighborhoods and the watersheds that run beneath them, between children and the living world they were born into, but have rarely been allowed to truly touch. You can see it in the growing field of ecotherapy, where psychologists are documenting what indigenous peoples always knew. That time spent in genuine attention to the natural world does not just reduce stress. It restores something structural, something in the way the mind organizes itself, something that urban life quietly dismantles, layer by layer, year by year, until the silence of a forest feels less like peace and more like threat. But the most important place you can see that legacy is not in a movement, or a study, or a television program about wilderness survival. It is in you, right now. In the part of you that felt something shift while listening to this. The part that recognized, in the description of a person moving through a frozen forest with 400 grams of carefully chosen tools and centuries of inherited wisdom, not a stranger from another time, but something familiar. Something you have always carried but rarely been given permission to use. Your instincts are not broken. Your awareness has not been destroyed. It has been buried. Under convenience, under noise, under the comfortable illusion that someone else, some app, some device, some system built by strangers, knows better than your own body what you need to survive. They built their kit from the earth and returned it to the earth when they were done. They took nothing that was not offered. They wasted nothing that was given. And in doing so, they did not just survive the wilderness. They became fluent in it. They learned its grammar, its rhythm, its silences, and its warnings, and its moments of extraordinary, unannounced generosity. And somewhere inside you, beneath every notification, and every convenience, and every layer of modern noise that has accumulated over a lifetime, that same fluency is waiting. Not as a memory, as a capacity, as something that was always yours, and has never fully left. This is Primal Echoes, where the forgotten speaks. If this video opens something in you, something quiet, and old, and worth paying attention to, then subscribe. Because next time, we are going inside the winter world of the Viking Longhouse, and we are going to discover how a people living in darkness and ice for 6 months of the year not only survived the unsurvivable, but built a civilization so resilient that its architecture, its psychology, and its technology are still being studied by engineers and historians today. The old ways are not behind us. They are beneath us, waiting to be remembered. And when we do remember them, we will not just survive this world. We will finally learn how to belong to it again.